Hello again. Prophecy Coming Alive with Chuck Suchman. The last time we were together, we spoke about Zechariah chapter 12, Israel being the burdensome stone. All the world will be possessed with Israel and Jerusalem. And we learned in Zechariah chapter 12 that the nations around Israel, they're going to be cut to pieces, the Lord says. That Jerusalem will be a burden to these other places around the world, especially neighboring nations around Israel. And they'll be cut to pieces, God says. We'll pick up with Zechariah chapter 12, verse 11. Remember, I said in that day refers to the end times. In that day shall there be a great mourning in Jerusalem. The land shall mourn. Every family will mourn. The house of David will mourn. All the families of Israel will mourn. We'll find out in the next chapter of Zechariah. All the families that remain, every family apart and their wives apart, will mourn. I'll look at chapter 13, and we're going to find out that Israel, the people of Israel, will mourn. There will be sorrow in Israel. Because I'm going to read this chapter 13, verses 8 and 9. God says 2/3 of all Israel will be killed. He says there'll be 1/3 that survive. And then he says, I will refine the 1/3 as silver is refined. I will test them as gold is tested in the fire. And we'll pick up that verse a little bit later. Zechariah chapter 13, and again in that day is the end times. We're there. In that day there shall be a fountain open to the house of David and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin, for uncleanness. It shall come to pass in that day, saith the Lord of hosts, that I will cut off the names of the idols out of the land, and they shall no more be remembered. I will cause the prophets and unclean spirit to pass out of the land. God will have his hand upon those that worship idols. He's going to wipe them out. They won't be remembered anymore. The unclean spirit will pass out of the land. And it shall come to pass that when any shall prophesy, then his father and his mother that begat him shall say unto him, Thou shalt not live, for thou speakest lies in the name of the Lord. And his father and his mother that begat him shall thrust him through when he prophesies. And one shall say unto him, speaking of Jesus, and one shall say unto him, What are these wounds in thy hands? As Zechariah chapter 13, verse 6. He shall answer, Those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. Verse 8, It shall come to pass, and in all the land of Israel, 2/3 therein shall be cut off and die, but the third shall be left therein. I'll bring the third through the fire, and will refine them as silver is refined, and I'll try them as gold is tried. They shall call on my name, and I will hear them, and I will say, It is my people. And they shall say, The Lord is my God. The time of Zechariah 13 is coming very soon. Moving from Zechariah 13 to Zechariah 14. we're going to see what God is going to do to the sinners on earth. The flesh on their bodies will melt. Their eyes will melt from their sockets. It's going to be terrible. Zechariah chapter 14. Behold, the day of the Lord comes. I will gather, verse 2, I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. In prophecy, we see in other places where God gathers the nations, like in Joel chapter 3, God gathers the nations against Jerusalem. I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. The city will be taken, the houses will be rifled, and the women will be raped. Half of the city will go into captivity. The rest of the people should not be cut off from the city. Then shall the Lord go forth. This is Zechariah chapter 14, verse 3. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as he fought in the day of battle. God will be seen in Israel. We see that when we read Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39, that God says in chapter 39, verse 7, that I am in Israel. God is in Israel. We'll cover Ezekiel 38 and 39 sometime in the future. Back to Zechariah chapter 14, verse 4. The Lord will fight against those nations. It says in verse 4, his feet will stand upon the Mount of Olives. That is land across the valley from Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives. As you stand on the Mount of Olives, you will see the Golden Gate, as the Jews call it. Christians call it the Eastern Gate, where Jesus will walk through. In front of the gate, you will see a cemetery. The cemetery is built right in front of the Eastern Gate. The reason it was built, the cemetery was put in by the Muslims. They buried their people there in the cemetery so that Jesus would refrain from going through the Eastern Gate. The Muslims believed that if they would block the gate with their graves, that Jesus would not desecrate the graves and pass through them. But in front of the Eastern Gate, we have graves, but Jesus is going through the Eastern Gate, or as the Jewish people call it, the Golden Gate. Jesus' feet, verse 4, chapter 14, will stand in that day, in the day, upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem, on the east. You have the Valley of Jehoshaphat, also known as the Kidron Valley, between the Mount of Olives and Jerusalem. And someday I'll speak of a war that will take place in that Valley of Jehoshaphat. His feet will stand that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives will cleave in the midst thereof and go toward the east and toward the west. And there'll be a very great valley formed from the separation. Half the mountain will go toward the north and half toward the south. This is important to remember, Zechariah chapter 14, verse 4. Because it's upon the Mount of Olives that Jesus comes down. Later on, I'll be reading from chapter 19 of the book of Revelation. Chapter 19 tells us about Jesus coming down with the saints to save Israel. And he'll land on the Mount of Olives. How do we know it? We know it because we just read it in Zechariah chapter 14, verse 4. So when we get to chapter 19 of Revelation, we'll refer back to this verse. It shall come to pass, Zechariah 14, verse 6, it shall come to pass, here we have in that day, that the light shall not be clear nor dark. It shall be one day which shall be known to the Lord. Not day, not night, but it shall come to pass that at evening time it shall be light. And it shall be in that day that living waters shall go out from Jerusalem, half of them toward the former sea, half toward the hinder sea. They're talking about the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. Verse 9, the Lord shall be king over all the earth. Now let me read that again. The Lord will be king over all the earth. In that day there shall be one Lord, one God. Still reading from Zechariah chapter 14. There'll be a plague in the land of Israel. Verse 12. And this will be the plague wherein the Lord will smite the people that have fought against Jerusalem. This will be the plague that the Lord will use. He will smite the people that have fought against Jerusalem. I need to read it again. The plague of the people that come against Israel, Jerusalem. Their flesh shall consume away while they stand upon their feet. Their eyes will consume away in the holes in the eye sockets. Their tongue will melt away in their mouth. And it shall come to pass in that day again that a great tumult from the Lord shall be among them, and they shall lay hold every one on the hand of the other, and his hand shall rise up against the hand of his neighbor. And Judah also shall fight at Jerusalem, and the wealth of all the heathen round about, all the lands around Israel, shall be gathered together, gold and silver, apparel in great abundance. And so shall the plague of the horse, of the mule, of the camel, of the donkey, all of them will have the same plague. The flesh will melt off their bodies. And it shall come to pass that everyone that's left of all the nations will come up to Jerusalem every year to worship the King. It shall come to pass that everyone left of the nations will come up to Jerusalem from year to year to worship the King. This would be a good place to stop for today. Thank you for being with me this past few minutes. Thank you.